In the gaming realm, when I think of masterpieces, I primarily think of games that were super successful. I wouldn't be going out on a limb by calling games like Knights of the Old Republic, Super Mario World, or Halo Combat Evolved masterpieces because there are millions of people who played and loved those games that would agree with me. Them being masterpieces is precisely why it isn't controversial to call them one. Their quality gave them massive fan bases. This is why it's so disheartening to me that Dead Space 2, one of the best games I have ever played and still play almost 12 years after it was released, had disappointing sales at release and now is almost never talked about. And this is what leads me to say that Dead Space 2 is the most overlooked masterpiece of all time. When I say it had disappointing sales, it did still sell a few million copies and sold better than the original game, but the mistake that EA made was thinking a survival horror game where the core gameplay mechanic is dismembering deformed monsters would be a giant commercial franchise. They spent $60 million promoting Dead Space 2. So although Dead Space 2 sold better than the original, it was still seen as a disappointment because of EA's overly high commercial expectations. I'm not saying EA shouldn't have promoted it at all, but it's not a franchise that ever was going to have the mass appeal they hoped for, which is easy for me to say with over a decade of hindsight, but still. What that means is that although it wasn't Halo 3 or Grand Theft Auto 5 or some other game that sold a ton, it was as good as, if not better than all the games that did sell better, and if you are familiar with Dead Space 2 and you've played it, you know exactly how good of a game it is. The people who do know about Dead Space 2 know about Dead Space 2. For me, almost 10 years ago, I was a 13-year-old on summer vacation when my dad handed me a copy of a new game he got me that I did not ask for. That game was Dead Space 2. I had never played a horror game before. I hadn't played the first Dead Space prior, and to be completely honest, it took me a solid year or two before I finally got over being too scared to play it. This probably sounds cliche, but it really was unlike any game I had ever played before. I mostly played first-person shooters like Halo or Call of Duty, but I had played third-person shooters like the OG Star Wars Battlefront games or Gears of War. What immediately jumped out as being different about Dead Space from other third-person shooters was how there's basically no UI. Your health is on your back, your ammo displays on your gun, everything happens in-game. Even when you do check your inventory, it's a screen that appears in front of Isaac in the game. The original developers who came up with this deserve all the credit in the world for making an amazingly immersive system, which is especially important in a horror game. Whether you're at a store, save station, reading text logs, or anything else, unless the game is paused, you aren't safe. After spending probably an hour going through the opening rooms waiting for something to jump out at me, I eventually ran into necromorphs, the primary enemies of the franchise. Necromorphs are creepy as hell and reminiscent of the body horror of John Carpenter's The Thing, while the environments you fight them in are reminiscent of the Xenomorph Hive in Aliens. The best part of necromorphs is how their design lends itself to the gameplay. Before anything else in combat, the game teaches you how to use kinesis to impale enemies. This is cool enough, but it gets taken to the next level once you get the plasma cutter. With the plasma cutter, the game teaches you that the best way to kill necromorphs is by dismembering them. This works with the kinesis, where one of the best strategies for conserving ammo is to sever one of the necromorph's arms and then use it to impale them. Now that I have played the first Dead Space, I can say that kinesis is one of my favorite changes to the second game. The original did have kinesis, but it was relegated to just being something to use to solve puzzles and for throwing explosive barrels. Otherwise, it was practically useless. Making kinesis viable in combat completely changes ammo conservation and makes encounters more dynamic. Another one of my favorite changes to the second game is giving Isaac a voice actor and a real face. Having a silent protagonist in the first game is weird when people are constantly telling him what to do and he says nothing, or when the most horrific things happen in front of him and he doesn't say a word. Gunnar Wright does an awesome job as Isaac Clarke, and I love the story of this game where he's simultaneously trying to stop the necromorph outbreak while also battling his own grief of his dead girlfriend. In Dead Space 2, you feel more connected to Isaac than you do in Dead Space 1. There are obviously game franchises where having a silent protagonist works well, but Dead Space I think benefited greatly from making this change. Eventually, after fighting children, killing velociraptors, getting blown up by an exploding armed guy, rage quitting, returning, running away from a Michael Myers monster and destroying the marker, I did beat it and actually got fairly good at it. So good that I felt confident enough to try and beat Hardcore mode. If you don't know, Hardcore mode in Dead Space 2 is essentially the second hardest difficulty survivalist, except there are no checkpoints and you can only save 3 times throughout the entire game. So, say you die on Chapter 6 and haven't saved yet, you would be sent back to the start of the game. My first attempt, I completely screwed up and saved on Chapter 4, but after a complete restart, I managed to get to Chapter 7 before making my first save. Over the next couple of months, I managed to work my way to beating the game on Hardcore, which then allowed me to blow through the game on Zealot difficulty with the greatest gun of all time. Dead Space 2 on hardcore is probably the most tense gaming experience I have ever had. When comparing this game to the original Dead Space, most people I've seen say that the original is scarier and has better atmosphere. Let me tell you, playing Dead Space 2 with no checkpoints and without being able to save is horrifying. I originally did all this when I was still in high school. After beating the game on Zealot and getting every achievement on the Xbox version, I went about 6 years without playing it. I picked it back up a couple weeks ago on a new Xbox account so I could re-unlock all the achievements for it, and I had completely forgotten just how good it was, and I got back into the groove pretty quickly and found out that I am much better at the game now. Whereas hardcore for me as a 16-year-old took months, I beat hardcore a few days ago without dying in about 5 hours. And let me tell you, it was incredibly nerve-wracking and just as fun as it was years ago. All 3 Dead Space games are available through EA Play and Game Pass Ultimate on the Xbox. If you haven't played any Dead Space game, you could jump right into the second game like I did, but in hindsight, I wish I had played the original first. Dead Space 2 packs a much bigger punch if you play the original prior in terms of story and just the gameplay and the ways it improves on the original. I had a greater appreciation for what Dead Space 2 does after I played the first game. But that's it for this video. I prefer Dead Space 2 to Dead Space 1. Let me know why you agree or disagree in the comments. Let me know what you thought of this video, and I do plan on making more, so if you enjoyed it, then maybe subscribe. Catch you later.